Hey guys, tonight we're traveling to a sun-scorched world where the air shimmers with heat, the sand burns beneath your feet, and the very idea of ice seems like a mirage. You're standing in ancient Persia, roughly 2,500 years ago, somewhere near the edge of a vast desert. Your robe is sticking to your back, your sandals are full of grit, and the idea of air conditioning? Yeah, not invented for another 24 centuries. And yet, across the dunes, you spot a strange dome rising from the earth. It's smooth, mud-colored, and oddly shaped, like a giant beehive. You're about to step inside and discover a world so cold, your teeth might chatter. Welcome to the mystery of the Yakshul, an ice house in the middle of the desert. You probably won't survive this journey unless you're very good at drinking warm goat milk and sleeping under wool in 40 degrees Celsius weather. But don't worry, I've got you. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You squint up at the sky. The sun is lowering, finally. The air's still hot, but there's a breeze. You start walking, slowly, dust curling around your ankles, toward that strange dome you saw. It looks like it's made of baked clay and straw. A little weathered, sure, but surprisingly intact for something that's supposed to hold ice. You duck inside. The temperature drops instantly. Not freezing, but cool, surprisingly cool. The walls are thick, made from a mix of sand, clay, egg whites, lime, and goat hair. That's right, goat hair. It helps hold the plaster together. The shape, wide at the bottom, narrow at the top, forces hot air upward, trapping cold air down where you're standing. It's quiet. Just you, the occasional drip of water, and the soft crunch of straw underfoot. Historians still argue whether the ancient Persians invented this completely on their own or borrowed the idea from Mesopotamian or Central Asian cultures. But one thing's certain, they perfected it. These yakshuls weren't just ice containers. They were architectural marvels, some nearly 60 feet tall, capable of storing thousands of liters of ice throughout the summer. Your hand brushes against something. It's cold. Actually cold. A block of ice, half submerged in a pit below. You can barely believe it. Here's the secret. The Persians didn't just use these in winter. They worked year-round. In colder months, ice would be harvested at night and packed away. In summer, water channeled from underground canets would keep the interior cool. The walls, up to 2 meters thick at the base, insulated the space so well that it could maintain cold temperatures even when it was 40 degrees Celsius outside. You sit down on a small woven mat left by one of the caretakers. You wonder who built this, how long it took. You can almost see a line of workers hauling bricks and plaster in the brutal sun, quietly crafting this chill haven. There's a kind of stillness to it. Even the air feels respectful, like it knows it's in the presence of something improbable. And the desert outside? Still baking. Somewhere out there, camels are trudging past. Merchants are shouting in the bazaar. But here, inside this mud dome, is proof that humans have always found clever ways to bend nature to their will. One odd little detail that often gets lost in the grand story. Many of these yakshuls were strategically placed near cemeteries. Not for refrigeration reasons, mind you. Scholars guess that it had more to do with available land, or possibly religious beliefs about purification and cold. But the idea of cooling your rosewater sorbet right next to Grandpa's resting place? Let's just say Persian practicality knew no bounds. As night begins to fall, the outside temperature drops dramatically. You slip outside again, your face greeted by dry winds, and glance up at the stars slowly fading into view. The yakshul behind you seems to glow faintly in the moonlight, like a frozen ghost in the desert. And you start to wonder, if this was just the beginning, what other chilling secrets do these ancient Persians have waiting? You leave the yakshul behind for now, stepping into the cooling night air. The desert has softened, the sand no longer blistering underfoot. Your robes flutter slightly in the breeze, and your curiosity carries you onward, to the secret veins beneath the earth, the canets. Picture this, a network of underground tunnels carved by hand, stretching for miles beneath the sand, gently sloping downward to move water from mountain aquifers to dry, thirsty cities. The Persians didn't just build one or two. They built thousands, like an invisible web crisscrossing the empire. And unlike most things in the desert, they were built to last. You crouch beside one of the ventilation shafts, a small stone-lined opening in the sand, about the width of a barrel. Peering down, you hear the trickle of water far below. It's faint but clear, like a secret whisper from beneath the earth. Historians still argue whether the earliest qanats appeared in western Iran or somewhere closer to modern-day Afghanistan. What's clear is that whoever figured it out was an absolute genius. Gravity-powered irrigation with no moving parts, no pumps, and minimal evaporation? It's the kind of ancient hack that makes you wonder what your ancestors were doing with their spare time. Probably inventing sandals that break after 2 wears. You begin walking beside the qanat's surface path, noting the evenly spaced shafts, each about 20 meters apart. These weren't just for ventilation or maintenance. They also marked the builder's progress. Dig, drop a shaft, move on. It was both an engineering marvel and a bureaucratic necessity. Some qanats extended over 70 kilometers. That's longer than some people walk in a year. Now imagine building that in the pre-backhoe era. A team of specialized workers, known as mechanis, would dig these channels using only hand tools, ropes, and buckets. They worked in absolute darkness, often in pairs, one digging, the other hauling soil. They earned decent wages, but it was dangerous work. Cave-ins were common, and many lost their lives in pursuit of water. You pass a small village just beginning to stir. A few early risers are gathering water from a shallow qanat outlet, a karais. The water is surprisingly cool, even though the sun hasn't been up long. That's because the channels are deep, sometimes up to 300 feet underground, shielded from the blistering heat above. And here's the connection. These qanats weren't just for drinking or farming. They fed directly into yakshals, providing a steady source of cool water to keep ice frozen even in the hottest months. The qanats would gently flow into underground basins, sometimes through a system of filters made from crushed charcoal, sand, and even, brace yourself, camel bone. You'd think ice made from camel bone filtered water would taste odd, but apparently it was refreshing. Or at least no one dared complain. You crouch beside a young boy rinsing dates in a wooden bowl. He smiles and offers you one. You chew thoughtfully, sweet, sticky, and perfect. Beside him, a ceramic jug rests partially submerged in the qanat stream. It's full of rosewater and honey, cooled by the earth itself. You pause beneath a pomegranate tree, its gnarled limbs stretching over a qanat-fed irrigation trench. Insects buzz lazily around the blossoms. The air smells faintly of mint and wet clay. A tiny lizard scurries by. Somewhere in the distance, someone is pounding grain with a stone mortar. Life continues, quiet, rhythmic, and in perfect sync with the ancient infrastructure that sustains it. You take another sip from a cooled jug. Your fingers are sticky from the dates. The water tastes of limestone, maybe a little iron, but it's cold. Not icy, but refreshing enough to make you sigh. You think about what it must have been like to plan all this. No aerial maps, no computers, just trial, error, and a deep, almost spiritual understanding of terrain. The engineers had to calculate slopes so precisely that even 1 extra degree could ruin a qanat. Too steep, and the water would erode the tunnel. Too shallow, and it wouldn't flow at all. The phrase, gentle precision, comes to mind, appropriate for a culture that worshipped both math and the moon. And here's your quirky tidbit of the night. Some qanats were given names, like family members or beloved pets. The giver, the silent one, little mountains whisper. Were they superstitious? Probably. But when your water source lives underground, you'd want to stay on its good side too. As the sky begins to shift from deep violet to orange, you realize you've walked miles alongside this underground river. You've barely broken a sweat, thanks to the breeze and the whispering water beneath your feet. And then, far ahead, you see another yakshal peeking above the horizon, round, silent, waiting. You smile, already knowing what to expect inside. But before you step into its cool belly, you glance back once more at the sand, the air, and the invisible veins beneath them all. The Persians didn't just cool the desert. They conquered it, quietly, patiently, and with just enough camel bones to keep things interesting. The Yakshal's great dome rises like a sand-colored moon ahead of you, and you find yourself instinctively slowing down. Its surface is mottled and rough, pocked with time and sun, yet still imposing. You step closer, brushing your fingers against its exterior. It's warm to the touch, of course. It's been baking under desert sun, but you know the real magic lies within. A small, arched entryway yawns open near the base. You duck slightly as you step inside, and immediately, the temperature shifts. It's not cold exactly, but cooler, noticeably so. The thick, insulated walls do their job well. As your eyes adjust, you begin to see the full scope of it. The floor dips downward into a subterranean chamber, dug deep to escape the worst of the desert's fury. You descend slowly, each footstep echoing against the curved interior. The air here is dense with earth and stillness, faintly tinged with something sweet, perhaps dried apricots once stored in here, or old rose petals. This is where the ice lived. And no, the ice didn't just magically appear. It was made, deliberately, cleverly, with all the precision of a desert sorcerer armed with nothing but clay, night air, and science. Here's how they did it. In winter, shallow pools, called ice basins, were dug near the Yakshal, fed by the Kanats. These pools were incredibly shallow, usually only a few inches deep. Why? Because that maximized surface area and allowed even the faintest desert chill to do its work. By morning, a thin layer of ice would have formed. Workers, often family groups, would rise before dawn, break the fragile sheets, and stack them carefully inside the Yakshal. Over time, that ice became a slow-growing sculpture of survival. Mainstream historians agree that this method of freezing water using desert night temperatures was widely used across ancient Persia. But here's a fringe theory you might enjoy while lounging in the cool. Some suggest they placed flat ceramic plates in the ice pools to encourage freezing by reducing surface ripples. Others believe that bits of straw were used as a kind of primitive insulation between the ice layers, preserving the precious harvest for as long as possible. Stacking the ice wasn't just brute labor. It was strategy. The ice had to be arranged in layers, sometimes separated by insulating materials, such as ash, straw, or even dried animal dung, to slow melting. You know, just in case you needed another reminder that ancient ingenuity sometimes came with an aroma. And this is where the Yakshal's design shines. The structure itself was often made from a unique waterproof mortar called saruj, a mix of clay, egg whites, ash, lime, and goat hair. It sounds like something a wizard might spread on toast, but it worked like a charm. This mixture made the walls not only water-resistant but also incredibly durable. Some Yakshals still stand after centuries of wear. Historians still debate whether the domed shape was inspired by Persian mausoleums or early ice cellar designs imported from the East. Either way, the result is unmistakable. A passive refrigeration system so effective, it could preserve ice for months into the brutal summer. You continue deeper into the chamber. The sloping floor leads you to a basin, a hollow dug straight into the earth. This was the final resting place for the season's ice, carefully protected from the sweltering heat above. Sometimes food was stored alongside it, rosewater syrups, pickled limes, or chilled dairy for special occasions. You kneel beside the basin, imagining the muffled clinks of ice being moved and reshuffled. Maybe there were arguments over who got the last clean slab. Maybe some father made a joke about hiding from his wife in here. Maybe a young girl sneaked in on a dare, just to lick the wall. You reach out and touch the stone lining the basin. Still cool. Still doing its job. Above you, narrow ventilation shafts poke through the dome, allowing hot air to escape upward while drawing cooler air down, a natural convection system. It's the kind of design modern engineers still reference when building off-grid homes or eco-resorts. You take a deep breath. The air smells faintly metallic now, tinged with mineral dust and thyme. Somewhere nearby, a bird calls, a lonely warble echoing through the dome's upper chamber. Outside, the sun is climbing higher, But in here, you're wrapped in shadow, in silence, in stone-cold brilliance. And here's your odd fact of the night. Some Persians used their stored ice to make a dessert called faluda, a sort of ancient sorbet made with rice noodles, rosewater, and lime. Yes, it sounds weird. Yes, you'd probably eat 3 bowls if someone offered it to you right now. You recline against a gently sloped wall, thinking of ice slowly forming under the stars, of hands stacking delicate sheets like glass, of water transformed by time and planning and patience. It's peaceful here. You could fall asleep with your head resting against a block of winter, preserved in clay and care. And outside, the sun keeps raging. But in here, you're safe. You're cool. You're part of a centuries-old solution to one of humanity's most basic problems. The desert may burn, but you have ice. You wake, in this dreamlike yakshal, to the faint creak of distant footsteps, echoes from centuries past. Imagine the workers, wrapped in thick shawls even in the desert, shuffling down the narrow corridors to check on their icy treasure. These weren't just storehouses, they were high-maintenance, carefully monitored preservation systems. And the people who kept them running weren't engineers with degrees. They were farmers, tradespeople, family members. You pause by the narrow vent cut into the side of the dome, your fingers tracing the edges. These weren't there for decoration. The Persians mastered a cooling method that didn't just stop at storage. They engineered airflow. Wind catchers, called badgers, sometimes connected to the yakshal, guiding breezes into the structure, directing warm air up and out like a giant breathing lung made of clay. Some historians argue whether these wind catchers were always part of the design or added later as an upgrade. Others claim they existed primarily in wealthier regions with more architectural resources. Either way, their inclusion shows a deep understanding of passive climate control, centuries before air conditioners were even a flicker in someone's overheated imagination. And the secret ingredient in all of this? Patience. Unlike modern refrigeration, which hums and clicks and demands electricity, the yakshal was utterly still. It worked with the rhythm of the seasons. If winter brought little ice, there was simply less to store. But that also meant the community had to work together to ration what they had, to decide which treats or cool drinks were worth the precious frost. It added a sacred weight to every chilled apricot and frosty bowl of faluda. As you stroll around the curved walls of the chamber, you notice something curious: faint carvings. Maybe a few names, a date, or just doodles. It's impossible to know if they're ancient graffiti or later additions, but it makes you smile. Someone once stood where you're standing now, bored out of their mind during ice duty, scratching something into the wall for future daydreamers. A fringe theory some enthusiasts whisper about, that yakshals weren't just for practical use. Some speculate these cool, silent chambers were used for meditation, or even early science experiments with cooling herbal concoctions. A few scattered scrolls mention cool rooms for thought in poetic language, but historians still argue whether this was metaphor or a forgotten custom. Let's face it, you're not here for lab results. You're here for the wonder of it. The quiet miracle of people who tamed summer. Stepping back toward the dome's edge, you picture a full winter in motion. Families out at dawn, scooping ice into woven baskets. Kids daring each other to lick the surface and run before their tongues stuck. Carefully packing each layer, one after the next, with straw and cloth and good wishes. Because the real beauty of the yakshal wasn't just the ice, it was the faith in tomorrow. You don't stack frozen sheets in a dark pit unless you believe you'll need them when the sun comes back swinging. Every block stored was a promise. Summer will come, but we'll be ready. And here's tonight's quirky tidbit. Some yakshals reportedly doubled as makeshift event spaces. Birthdays, secret meetings, perhaps even romantic rendezvous, all in the cool hush of subterranean chill. After all, when it's 43 degrees Celsius outside, you throw your best parties with the ice. That's the kind of flexibility we rarely give ancient structures credit for. In modern times, we tend to think of old buildings as single-use. This was for storing grain, or this was a tomb. But in reality, people were people. If it was cool, clean, and had good acoustics, someone probably brought a drum and some pomegranates. You lean back against the wall once more, letting your eyes wander across the gentle curves of the ceiling. No sharp lines. No harsh sounds. Just the faint, reassuring breeze of physics and mud brick elegance. And somewhere up above, on the surface of the desert, the sun keeps burning. But its fury can't touch you down here. Not today. You take one last look at the floor basin. Maybe there's no ice now, maybe just dust and echoes. But the space remembers. And so will you. You linger near the center of the Yakshul, where the floor dips into that mysterious basin, the ice pit. It's deeper than it looks, and the walls descend with a gentle taper, like the inside of a vast clay tulip. You imagine yourself standing at the bottom, the cool stillness wrapping around you like a sleep-heavy blanket. It's peaceful, but also practical. This design wasn't just aesthetic. It was geometry working overtime. By creating a conical pit, ancient Persian engineers ensured that cold air, the kind that likes to settle, would stay pooled down here. Warm air, on the other hand, would rise and be whisked out through the upper vents. It's like nature's own version of VIP seating. Cold goes to the bottom, heat gets kicked upstairs. Now picture the real work. In midwinter, you'd help the community haul ice, sometimes chipped from nearby rivers, sometimes painstakingly created in shallow outdoor pools. These pools, known as ice gardens or ice fields, were the staging grounds. By night, when temperatures dropped dramatically, a thin film of water would freeze. By morning, it was collected. Rinse and repeat. Every single day. Some days were disappointing, too warm, too windy, or just unlucky. And some years, the yield was too low to fill even half a Yakshul. But that didn't stop them. These were people who'd figured out how to outweed the desert. Giving up wasn't in the plans. One of the more mainstream historical facts worth noting is that these systems weren't isolated oddities. From the Achaemenid Empire through the Qajar dynasty, Yakshuls remained in use for centuries. They popped up in desert towns across Iran, each with its own tweaks, some taller, some wider, some more integrated into surrounding buildings. But the core principle remained: clay, air, and cold. You climb the pit in your mind's eye, noting how the walls are coated with sarouj, that magical, ancient waterproof plaster. It wasn't just thrown together. Sarouj was a careful mix: clay, lime, goat hair, ash, and sand, sometimes even egg whites, brewed like a desert potion and slathered on thick. This stuff could last for centuries. No mold, no rot, just resilience. And because we love a good fringe theory around here, there's a whisper among local legends that some master builders buried tokens, small charms or personal items, inside the walls of Yakshuls for good luck. Were they spiritual? Sentimental? Insurance against the elements? Historians still argue whether these stories are metaphorical, literal, or just poetic nonsense from long-forgotten bedtime tales. But you like to believe it. You like the idea that someone centuries ago pressed a bead or coin into the wet plaster and hoped for a good harvest, or maybe just a peaceful summer. As your fingers trace the curve of the dome above, you picture the labor behind it. Mud brick after mud brick, dried under a harsh sun, hoisted and stacked with aching arms. No forklifts. No blueprints. Just inherited knowledge, a shared goal, and the kind of neighborly cooperation you don't find often anymore. Building a Yakshul wasn't a solo act, it was a symphony of hands. And here's a tidbit for your next awkward dinner party. The word Yakshul literally means ice pit. But in modern Persian, it now refers to your standard refrigerator. So technically, every time you open your fridge, you're channeling the legacy of this ancient wonder, minus the goat hair plaster. Another curious fact: some of these structures were built so well, they outlived the reason for their existence. Today, several ancient Yakshuls still stand, empty but intact. Tourists sometimes stumble upon them, marvel at the design, and then walk away not realizing they've just seen a form of time travel. These buildings are whispers from an era that mastered the art of waiting. You take a breath, cool and deep. Imagine crouching at the edge of the pit, brushing a finger through the straw once used to insulate each layer of ice. You picture the meticulous routine: a block of ice, a layer of straw, another block, another layer. Like making a frozen lasagna with ancient tools and zero margin for error. And oh, the payoff. When summer rolled in and the desert turned to fire, you'd slip into this structure, chisel out a piece of winter, and drop it into your clay cup. Sweet rosewater syrup, maybe a drizzle of honey, and voila, you had yourself the world's most hard-earned slushie. In that moment, the sun could rage all it wanted. You had your yakshal. You had cold. And you, just you, were the keeper of frost. You step out from the yakshal's cool embrace and feel the dry warmth on your skin again. It's midday, and the light hits everything like it's been sharpened. You squint. But don't worry, we're not trekking across the desert just yet. We're headed toward the other half of this icy miracle, the shallow, sunken water channels and ponds outside. They don't look like much, just flat, rectangular basins carved into the earth, but they were key to kickstarting the ice supply. These outdoor ice fields, or yakseisen, were strategically placed to take full advantage of the desert's nighttime temperature drops. That's right, despite being one of the hottest places on Earth by day, some Iranian deserts get cold enough at night for water to freeze. And the Persians. Oh, they were counting on it. Each winter evening, water was poured into these shallow pools. Smooth, level, motionless. Not too much, not too little. Just enough to form a delicate skin of ice by dawn. Then, like harvesting spinach leaves, workers would gently gather the fresh layers before the sun could melt them. Day by day, these thin films were stacked and stored, interleaved with straw, in the yakshal's pit. Ice farming, one razor-thin layer at a time. Now, here's the thing about these ice fields. Their placement wasn't random. You might think, it's just cold air and water, what's the big deal? But the orientation, shade, and even nearby walls mattered. Many were aligned east-west to minimize sunlight exposure. Some were flanked by long adobe walls to cast shade and block warm winds. It was climate control before we had any wires. Historians still argue whether some of these pools were lined with dark stone to absorb and re-radiate cold more effectively, or whether that's just a later interpretation. What's clear is that nothing was left to chance. Every factor, from airflow to wall height, was fine-tuned through generations of trial, error, and maybe a few curses muttered under frozen beards. And yes, there were failures. Imagine spending the whole night hauling water and laying it out just right, only for a warm breeze to sweep in and ruin it. The whole thing, gone by morning. Or worse, a dust storm frosting your carefully tended ice sheets with sand. Still, they persevered. Because when it worked beautifully. Let's get a little weirder. One fringe theory suggests that animals, like camels or oxen, were sometimes walked around the perimeter of the ice fields to tamp the earth, keeping it level and compacted. Was it effective? Maybe. Was it mostly an excuse to make the camels feel included? Who's to say? You imagine it, a quiet desert night, stars like spilled sugar above, and a line of camels trudging in sleepy circles while men whisper about tomorrow's weather. There's something oddly meditative about it. Like watching tea steep. And speaking of meditative, harvesting that ice wasn't a rush job. It had to be gentle. The ice was brittle and wafer-thin, especially in the early part of the season. You didn't yank or smash it. You coaxed it. Lifted it with wide blades, sometimes just with hands, always with patience. The work started before dawn. Quiet footsteps across frozen earth, breaths clouding in the air. The sun still below the horizon. A hushed ballet of motion. Maybe a rooster somewhere ruins the ambience, but otherwise? Peace. The community played a role too. It wasn't always a paid job. Sometimes it was a communal task, everyone pitching in to secure the town's summer ice. Older kids would help carry straw. Women might prepare the storage layers. Even those too frail to lift a shovel might still lend a watchful eye, pointing out uneven spots in the pools or warning of a warm patch of wind. This wasn't just about temperature control, it was a village syncing with the land. And for a moment, you picture yourself lying beside one of those pools. The night's chill seeping up from the earth, the stars stretching so far above you it makes your chest ache. The water beside you is still, glassy, waiting. You close your eyes and imagine you're part of this ancient rhythm. Then a frog croaks somewhere, and you're snapped out of it. Let's zoom out a little. This whole process was part of a broader Persian mastery of passive cooling. The same people who farmed ice in the desert also invented badgers, wind catchers, those tall, chimney-like structures that funnel breezes into homes. They weren't just cooling down their drinks, they were crafting entire environments of comfort in places where modern air conditioning would cry uncle. There's even a record, one of our mainstream facts, that during the reign of Darius I, ice and snow were transported from the mountains to Persepolis for royal banquets. Picture a sweating porter dragging sleds of frozen treasure down dusty roads, only to have some noble barely notice as they sip chilled pomegranate wine. So yes, the elites had ice. But so did ordinary people. That's what makes this story quietly astonishing. This wasn't a one-time imperial vanity project. It was practical, repeatable, scalable. It was ordinary magic. You stretch, eyes heavy now. The sun has dipped lower. You've watched 1,000 nights pass over these desert fields, each one freezing a little more water than the last. You've seen fingers tremble with cold and joy as that first perfect ice layer lifts off the surface. And you've heard the soft crunch of straw and frost as it's laid gently into the belly of the Yakshal. And somehow, knowing all that, how simple, how hard, how clever, it makes that first sip of rosewater on a summer day feel like a miracle. As the days pass, you've grown more accustomed to the rhythms of the Persian ice harvest. You're no longer just an observer, you're starting to feel the weight of history beneath your feet, the cool touch of ancient knowledge in the air. You walk beside workers as they transport ice to the village, the light starting to shift as evening falls. Soon, the Yakshal will be filled with ice, and the work will slow. But for now, there's one last detail we haven't covered: how the ice reached its final, frozen resting place, the vault. The vault, or Yakshal itself, was the heart of the Persian ice system. Now, when I say vault, you might imagine some grand, ornate structure, something befitting a king's treasure. Well, you wouldn't be entirely wrong, but you also wouldn't be entirely right. These vaults were more functional than beautiful, yet still carefully crafted to reflect the knowledge of generations. You might be picturing a large dome-shaped building, with thick mud brick walls rising up from the desert floor. Inside, though, things were remarkably simple. The ice was stacked, layered, and packed away into a central depression in the ground, which was lined with straw. The straw helped insulate the ice from the heat and acted as a cushion, making sure the ice didn't crack or melt too quickly. There's something quite soothing about the image of the ice being stacked neatly, just like a carefully made bed, to rest until it was needed. This wasn't just about keeping ice cold, it was about sustaining life. In the Persian Empire, ice was as valuable as gold. It was used to cool drinks, of course, but also to preserve food. Without refrigeration, the Persians had to rely on salt, drying, or these ice vaults to keep meat, dairy, and fruit fresh for longer periods. Ice was a commodity, and these vaults were the storage units that allowed entire villages to survive the blistering heat of summer. Historians still debate just how cold the ice stayed, given the open-air structure of the Yakshal and the relatively rudimentary insulation. Some believe it could have lasted weeks, others think it may have melted much quicker than anticipated. But one thing is certain: the process of storing ice in the desert was far more sophisticated than anyone in the Western world at the time could have imagined. Now, picture this for a moment. It's late afternoon, and the ice is being loaded into the Yakshal. The air is heavy, the work slow, but you can hear the workers' murmurs as they slide the ice down into the pit. The soft scrape of the ice against straw fills the silence, and you wonder just how many generations of people have followed this same process. While you watch, it's easy to lose track of time. You're caught in the unhurried pace of it all, the slow stacking, the careful packing, the trust in the Yakshal to keep the ice cool until the day it's needed. You can almost hear the hum of the desert itself, a distant sound in the background as the workers place the last pieces of ice into the vault. And here's where it gets even more intriguing. The Yakshal wasn't just a storage unit for ice. It was a marvel of architectural ingenuity. The dome, made from mud and brick, was designed to trap cool air and minimize heat exposure. The exterior was often coated with a reflective lime wash to help bounce the sun's rays away. The opening at the top helped the air circulate, creating a natural ventilation system that worked with the desert's temperature fluctuations. To the casual observer, it might seem like just another building. But to those who understood it, it was a masterpiece, a testament to the brilliance of Persian engineering. It's no wonder these structures were considered symbols of prosperity and ingenuity. Historians still argue about how exactly the Persians managed to maintain ice in these vaults for extended periods. Some believe that the natural evaporation of water played a role in the cooling process, while others suggest that the ice was simply replenished frequently. But whatever the exact method, there's no doubt that the people of ancient Persia knew how to manipulate their environment in ways we're only beginning to appreciate today. Meanwhile, as the ice settles into the Yakshal, your mind drifts to the strange, almost dreamlike notion of how much effort went into preserving something as simple as cold. Imagine walking into the vault on a scorching summer day, feeling the cool air hit your skin as you approach the ice. You'd know, without a doubt, that you were in the presence of something rare, something precious. But it wasn't just about survival. The ice represented a way of life, a culture that had learned how to bend the elements to its will. It's easy to forget just how much effort it took to store a commodity that we now take for granted. The refrigerators of today, those humdrum boxes we open without a second thought, owe their existence to the people who perfected the art of cooling in the harshest of climates. So, as the sun begins to set over the Yakshal, and the workers finish their long day's labor, you can't help but feel a deep sense of respect for the ingenuity that made all of this possible. It's a quiet achievement, one that doesn't scream for attention but instead hums softly in the background of history. Like the ice itself, it's enduring, hidden beneath layers of sand, straw, and time. The sun has set, the workers have left for the day, and you're left alone with the Yakshal, its dome-shaped silhouette now dark against the night sky. The quiet stillness of the desert seems to press in on you, the heat of the day dissipating into the cool, almost chilly evening air. There's something deeply peaceful about the whole scene. But beneath that tranquility, something else is happening, something that is the core of this entire process: preservation. As the ice sits within the Yakshal, it begins a slow but inevitable process of change. The heat of the desert day has already started to work against the carefully stored ice, but thanks to the clever engineering of the Yakshal, the ice doesn't simply melt away in a rush. Instead, it lingers. It takes its time, just like the entire process of making and storing it. You might be surprised to learn that the ice wasn't just a one-time use wonder. The people who relied on these Yakshals had methods for making sure they could get the most out of each batch. The ice didn't last forever, of course, but it was valuable enough that they found ways to stretch its life. Over the course of a few days or even weeks, the ice would slowly diminish, but it would continue to serve its purpose: cooling drinks, preserving food, and providing relief from the oppressive desert heat. It's almost hard to believe, but ice, so simple in our world today, was once a luxury. A precious commodity that could only be sourced from the effort and knowledge of those who understood the land and the elements. The ability to preserve it through such an unforgiving environment was a mark of sophistication. And to the people of ancient Persia, it wasn't just about convenience, it was about survival, and it was about making life just a little bit more bearable in an environment that didn't make that easy. Historians still debate how long the ice could truly last. Some sources suggest that the Persians could keep ice for months, while others argue that its shelf life was far shorter, perhaps only a week or two, before it began to melt too much for practical use. Regardless of the specific timeline, the fact that ice could even be kept for any length of time in such a hot environment is remarkable. And it's this fascinating reality that gives you a sense of how innovative the Persians were, not just in their ability to harvest ice but in how they worked with nature's limitations. At this point, you might be wondering about the everyday lives of the people who lived in those desert towns and villages. Surely, the ice would have been a prized possession, something the wealthy could afford to enjoy with ease. But what about the common folk? Did they have access to the luxury of ice, or was it reserved only for the elite? The truth is, ice wasn't just for the rich, it was something that was shared, a resource that brought entire communities together. People would gather around the Yakshal, taking turns to harvest and distribute the ice, whether it was for cooling their food or for making a sweet, refreshing treat. Here's where it gets interesting. In some cases, the ice itself would be transported to nearby towns and villages. The cold wasn't just confined to the Yakshal, it was used to cool local markets, helping preserve fish and meat, which were particularly vulnerable to spoilage in the heat. People would use it to chill milk, fruits, and even to cool water in the middle of a scorching day. The ice wasn't just a luxury, it was an essential tool in everyday life. Now, it's easy to imagine the scene. People standing around, eagerly waiting their turn at the Yakshal, or perhaps workers loading baskets of ice onto camels or carts, ready to distribute it far and wide. It wasn't just a matter of using ice, it was about timing, about knowing when to harvest and when to let the Yakshal rest. There's something almost meditative about the rhythm of it all, this balancing act between nature's timing and human necessity. You can imagine the sense of satisfaction a worker must have felt after a successful harvest, bringing a cool relief to the people of the village, knowing that their efforts were making a difference in the lives of so many. It's also worth considering that this was happening in a time long before the advent of modern refrigeration. There were no refrigerators or freezers like we have today, and certainly no styrofoam coolers for your picnic. The Yakshal was the cutting-edge technology of its time, and it wasn't just an engineering marvel. It was a symbol of the ingenuity that allowed life to continue in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Historians still argue about how widespread the use of these vaults truly was. Some believe the ice harvest was a practice unique to the wealthier regions of Persia, while others suggest that smaller, simpler versions of the Yakshal existed throughout the empire, serving even the most rural communities. Whatever the case, it's clear that the use of ice was a deeply embedded part of Persian culture, a testament to their mastery over their environment. And, as the night deepens, with the desert finally quieting down, you start to reflect on the life of the ice stored in the Yakshal. There's something peaceful about it, the slow, inevitable melt of it, the way it mirrors the passage of time. And as you listen to the faint winds stirring the desert sands, you realize that the history of ice in Persia is far from simple. It's a story of persistence, creativity, and resourcefulness that lives on, hidden beneath the sands of time. The next morning, the harsh sunlight returns, casting long shadows over the desert landscape. The Yakshal, still standing tall in the distance, seems almost like a mirage in the bright light. You can't help but admire its form, sturdy and purposeful, standing there, almost untouched by the passing of time. And yet, beneath its quiet surface, the secrets of ancient engineering continue to echo through history, waiting to be uncovered. You may have noticed by now that the Yakshal wasn't just a storage facility for ice, it was also a marvel of environmental adaptation. Ancient Persians understood the importance of using the land's natural elements to aid in the preservation of their food and ice. You might find it surprising, but in addition to the clever design of the vault, there was another crucial element: the surrounding environment itself. The desert may seem like the last place you'd think of for ice, but that's exactly what made the Yakshal so effective. The contrast between the scorching daytime heat and the freezing desert night created a unique environment where the ice could last much longer than it would in a more temperate climate. As the temperatures plummeted at night, the ice inside the Yakshal would freeze even more, expanding its lifespan. This balance between day and night, heat and cold, was key to the entire process, and it's a beautiful example of how the ancient Persians worked in harmony with nature. Think about it. The ice didn't need modern refrigeration systems to stay intact. It just needed a little bit of knowledge about how to work with the land's natural rhythms. The Persians didn't rely on electricity or gas. They relied on the earth itself, on its natural patterns and the simple yet sophisticated design of their structures. It's almost poetic, isn't it? The way the heat of the day and the chill of the night could work together to preserve something as delicate as ice. Historians still debate just how much this reliance on natural cycles influenced Persian society. Some argue that the success of the Yakshal and the overall sophistication of Persian engineering laid the groundwork for much of the empire's economic success. Others believe it was simply a matter of necessity. The people of Persia had no other choice but to innovate in order to survive in such a harsh environment. Whatever the case may be, the results speak for themselves. The Yakshal, with all its natural advantages, played a pivotal role in making life in the desert more livable. But what about the people who lived in these desert towns? What did they do when the ice was gone? It's easy to assume that ice was a luxury, something only the rich could afford. However, ice was far more democratized in ancient Persia than we might think. Even common folk could rely on these stores, and it's fascinating to consider how the use of ice might have been integrated into the daily lives of people across different social classes. In fact, the distribution of ice in ancient Persia was a carefully planned affair. The wealthy might have had private stores or access to ice for personal indulgences, but there were also public ice houses and communal uses of this precious commodity. The ice might be used to chill drinks or to preserve food, but it could also serve another crucial purpose: in medicine. It's often forgotten that in ancient times, ice had medical uses. Ice could be used to soothe fevers, reduce swelling, and even help with pain relief. Think about it: no modern-day aspirin or ice packs, just the natural remedy of cold to bring relief. Ice was the ancient version of modern-day cold therapy, and in the context of ancient Persia, it was a resource that could make a difference between life and death. Imagine being someone in a small desert village, receiving a cold compress to help with a fever during a brutal summer. That cold touch would have been more than a simple relief, it would have been a precious lifeline. Historians still discuss the extent to which ice was used in Persian medicine. While there are records suggesting that cold therapy was practiced, scholars aren't entirely sure how widespread the use of ice was for medical purposes. Was it limited to the elite? Or was it a practice that was shared among all levels of society? We don't know for sure, but the mere idea that ice was used as medicine speaks volumes about the ingenuity of the Persians, who used what they had, natural resources, to meet their needs. Back to the yakshal, though, the idea that something as simple as ice could be stored and used in such a variety of ways speaks to the sophistication of Persian engineering. And yet, even with all of their knowledge and resources, there were limits. Ice couldn't last forever. No amount of clever engineering or natural manipulation could stop the inevitable melting process. Eventually, the ice would disappear, and the yakshal would sit empty, waiting for the next harvest. In a way, the cyclical nature of the ice, its making, storage, and eventual melting, mirrors the cycles of life in the desert. Nothing lasts forever, but in the time it lasts, it serves a purpose. And in those moments, the ice was more than just a luxury. It was a symbol of human resilience, of finding ways to survive and thrive even in the harshest of environments. As you sit there, reflecting on the intricate relationship between the Persians and their ice, you can almost feel the coolness of it, still lingering in the air, like a whisper of the past. You realize that the yakshal wasn't just a structure, it was a testament to the resourcefulness of a civilization that knew how to make the most of what nature had to offer. Now, as we move further into the inner workings of the yakshal, let's think about the real beauty of these structures, their long-term sustainability. Unlike many ancient inventions, which have been lost to time, the yakshal left a legacy. The principles of building with nature, of working in harmony with the environment, didn't just vanish. They influenced how people across Persia, and eventually the wider world, approached everything from architecture to agriculture. The yakshal wasn't an isolated innovation, it was part of a much larger system of sustainable living that the Persians mastered. The empire, which stretched across vast swaths of land, from the steppes of Central Asia to the deserts of Arabia, had a keen understanding of how to adapt and survive in such a variety of climates. The yakshal was just one piece of a much larger puzzle of Persian ingenuity. Picture this: you're standing in a Persian garden, marveling at the lush greenery in a place where nothing should grow. The garden, an oasis in the middle of the desert, uses water stored in qanats, underground channels that brought water from distant mountains. These same qanats, much like the yakshal, were a product of ancient Persian engineering, designed to make the most of the scarce resources in the region. Both the gardens and the ice houses were connected by this overarching principle of working with nature, using what the earth offered to create sustainable systems that would last for generations. Historians still debate the extent to which these early innovations influenced later civilizations. Some claim that Persian engineers were so ahead of their time that they set the stage for the rise of more advanced technologies in the Roman Empire. Others argue that their innovations were merely practical solutions to the unique challenges of desert life and didn't have the same wide-reaching effects. Regardless of the answer, it's clear that the Persians were able to thrive in one of the harshest environments on Earth because of their resourcefulness. They didn't invent the wheel or the steam engine, but they certainly knew how to make the most of the tools they had. Now, imagine how different life must have been in the heart of the Persian Empire compared to other ancient civilizations. In places like ancient Egypt, where the Nile provided an abundance of water, or in Mesopotamia, where the rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates supported farming, the people could rely on the fertility of the land to sustain them. But in Persia, the land was unforgiving, and yet the people adapted. They didn't have the luxury of regular rainfall or fertile soil. They had to get creative. They built their civilizations in a way that allowed them to thrive even when the environment was working against them. The Yakshul was just one part of this larger, incredible feat. Speaking of creativity, have you ever wondered how the Persians transported the ice once it was harvested? We've already talked about the sophisticated architecture of the Yakshul, but what about the practicalities of moving the ice from one place to another, especially across the vast desert? You might imagine that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to carry ice without it melting too quickly. But, in true Persian fashion, the answer lay in clever, simple design. The ice wasn't transported in just any old container. It was carried in insulated vessels, often made from thick, layered materials. The Persians understood the importance of keeping the ice insulated during its journey, so they designed specific baskets and boxes that minimized exposure to the sun. The ice would be wrapped in a protective layer of straw or reed, materials known for their insulation properties. When you think about it, it's almost like the ancient Persian version of a modern cooler. You might chuckle at the thought of these early ice coolers, but the ingenuity behind them is undeniable. Even when faced with a desert landscape that could melt ice in an instant, the Persians found ways to make it work. Historians still argue about the scale of the ice trade in Persia. While it's clear that ice was important to the daily lives of people, it's less clear how widespread the ice trade was. Did small towns have their own yakshuls, or were large urban centers the only places where ice was stored and traded? Were there established routes for transporting ice, much like the silk routes for other goods? We may never know the full extent, but it's fascinating to think about the infrastructure that could have existed to support such a trade. Picture a bustling marketplace in a Persian city, with merchants offering up blocks of ice just as they would any other commodity. The very idea of a frozen commodity being traded in the desert is enough to make you pause and appreciate the skill and innovation of these ancient peoples. As you imagine these scenes, consider how different the world would be if ancient civilizations hadn't found such creative solutions to everyday problems. What if the Persians had simply accepted the harshness of their environment and given up on ice altogether? Would we even have the same understanding of refrigeration today? It's incredible to think about how a seemingly simple thing, like ice, could have such a profound impact on the course of history. The Yakshul, in all its glory, was a beacon of what humanity can achieve when necessity and creativity collide. It wasn't just about storing ice, it was about overcoming the odds, about making life possible in the harshest of climates. And it's a reminder that sometimes, the simplest solutions are the most ingenious. The Persian Empire's achievements in refrigeration weren't isolated to ice alone. The very principles that made their yakshuls so effective were applied across various aspects of their life. And so, let's take a step back and think about how those ancient Persians' cleverness affected their whole society. The yakshul wasn't just a marvel in itself, it was part of a larger cultural fabric that wove together architecture, agriculture, trade, and even leisure. It speaks to the ingenuity of a society that understood the delicate balance between nature, need, and innovation. You can picture a day in the life of someone living in the Persian Empire. It's an exhausting heat wave, the desert sun hovering relentlessly above. Yet, in the cool shade of the yakshul, people are lounging, enjoying icy water, and perhaps even a chilled drink. But, as the sun sets, that same heat returns with full force, and life continues in its relentless rhythm. The yakshul was not just a luxury, but a lifeline. These ice houses provided the people with something rare, a form of comfort, a reprieve from the ever-present desert heat. Just imagine, in the absence of air conditioning and modern cooling techniques, the value of this oasis of cold. Still, historians debate how accessible these ice houses were to the common person. Some believe that they were mostly for the elite, for the wealthy who could afford to indulge in such luxuries. After all, in a society where access to water itself could be scarce, how many people could really afford to regularly store ice? It's likely that the distribution of ice was very much tied to class and status. The rich and powerful might have used ice to cool their drinks, preserve food, and even in luxury baths, while the commoners would have had limited access. But on the other hand, the Persians were known for their elaborate public works projects and their dedication to providing for the people, so there's also the argument that these icehouses may have served a wider role in public life. Imagine the scene, a bustling Persian city with a few yakshals in the heart of the marketplace. The wealthier citizens have their own private stores of ice, but the icehouses in the market square are open to everyone. For a small fee, you can scoop up a chunk of ice to cool your drink or preserve some perishable food. This simple act, getting your hands on ice, becomes a way to momentarily escape the scorching desert heat, a fleeting sense of coolness in a world that otherwise feels unrelenting. But there's more to the Yakshal's story than simply providing ice. These ingenious structures were part of a complex system that underpinned the entire Persian economy. Water, which was stored and transported through qanats, was essential for many facets of life, from irrigation for agriculture to cooling homes in the heat of summer. And ice was no exception. The Persian Empire, in its prime, was a powerhouse of agricultural production. The ability to refrigerate food meant that long-distance trade could thrive. Persian merchants could transport delicate goods like fruits and vegetables over vast distances without worrying about spoilage. In a time before refrigeration, this gave them a massive edge over other empires. Take a moment to imagine being one of these traders, loading your goods onto a caravan of camels in the early morning light. You'd stop by a local yakshal to buy some ice, which would help keep your goods cool and fresh during the long journey. The heat of the day would be harsh, and the desert winds would blow relentlessly, but thanks to the Persian ingenuity, you were equipped to keep things fresh. Historians still argue whether this system was as widespread and organized as it seemed, or whether it was a more local affair. Some believe that it was primarily the large urban centers like Persepolis and Ctesiphon that benefited from such advanced refrigeration systems, while others suggest that even small villages might have had access to these wonders. Yet, despite the potential for widespread use, the yakshal's presence was often restricted by geography. Ice could only be stored in places where the natural conditions, such as temperature and available materials, were right for building these structures. Some parts of the empire, particularly the fertile plains or lush valleys, may not have seen as much need for refrigeration. In such places, ice would have been a rarity, something to marvel at rather than a routine part of life. On the other hand, in the desert regions where survival depended on innovation, the yakshal was likely seen as a necessity. Now, if you can picture this, you're beginning to realize the true scope of Persian refrigeration. It wasn't just about ice, it was about survival. The creation of ice in the middle of the desert may seem like a trivial luxury to us now, but back then, it was life-changing. In a world where food could spoil in the blink of an eye, where water was both a precious and elusive commodity, the ability to keep something as simple as a drink cold was revolutionary. The Persian Empire, with its combination of public works and innovative solutions to everyday problems, was one of the earliest examples of a society looking at the world's harshest challenges and saying, "We can do better." They didn't just adapt to the environment, they changed it to fit their needs. The yakshal, once a modest invention, became a symbol of Persian resilience, of their refusal to let the desert dictate the terms of their lives. And as we're about to see, this mastery of refrigeration and the cleverness that went into building these icehouses wasn't just an isolated success story, it would ripple outward, influencing generations to come. As we continue this journey through the ingenuity of ancient Persia, let's think about the wider implications of these yakshals. Their legacy goes beyond just refrigeration. They're part of a broader, deeply impressive system of knowledge, architecture, and societal organization that defined one of the world's earliest and most influential empires. These icehouses were a tangible product of Persian resourcefulness, and their engineering feats didn't end with their construction. No, the ability to store ice was only one piece of the puzzle. They were part of a larger tradition of Persian architecture and hydrology, an empire that made entire deserts habitable, lush, and thriving. You've probably heard the term qanat before, those long, sloping tunnels that brought water from underground sources to desert communities. It's safe to say that without the qanats, Persia wouldn't have had the luxury of creating ice in the first place. These ingenious water systems not only provided the necessary water for yakshals, but also enabled the agriculture that sustained Persian civilization. Imagine you're an ancient Persian engineer, surveying the landscape. You know that water is the lifeblood of the empire, but what if you could harness it in ways no one had before? Enter the cannet, a marvel of engineering that still inspires awe today. Cannets were typically built by digging vertical shafts into the earth, tapping into underground aquifers. These shafts would then connect to horizontal tunnels that led the water across vast stretches of land. In Persia's dry climate, where rainfall was scarce, these water tunnels were nothing short of magic. The cannet system allowed water to flow to places where it was most needed, from irrigation to providing the essential coolness that permeated Persian life. In many ways, cannets made it possible for people to live and thrive in some of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. But let's not forget about the broader social and cultural context of all this. Persian society, known for its opulence, had developed a complex understanding of luxury long before many other civilizations. And when we think of luxury today, it's often in terms of high-end gadgets, exotic vacations, or expensive brands. But for the Persians, luxury was about making everyday life bearable in a place where the climate was relentlessly harsh. A cool drink, a break from the desert heat, a refreshing dip, these were the luxuries that mattered. The yakshal wasn't just a place for ice, it was a hub of social interaction. People from different walks of life could come together to share in a moment of respite, to gather in the shade, and to cool off. Historians still argue over whether the widespread use of yakshals helped to create a more connected Persian society, or whether they were just symbols of class distinction. There's evidence that these icehouses, while certainly used by the elite, were also central to communal life in major cities like Ctesiphon and Persepolis. Whether it was a bustling market day, with traders exchanging goods in the cool shade, or a simple visit to pick up ice for the family's feast, these spaces offered a rare moment of shared experience in an otherwise hard world. Imagine the different kinds of people who would have walked through these doors: wealthy landowners looking for ice to preserve their food, merchants bringing the freshest fruits to be kept cool, farmers looking to offer a piece of their harvest to someone who could afford it. The yakshal was a place where the needs of the many were met, but also where the elegance and sophistication of Persian culture could shine. At the same time, though, historians believe there were perhaps more basic reasons for their creation. Some even argue that the origins of the yakshal were much more practical, born from the need to store ice in the desert heat rather than for any sort of luxury. As we dive deeper into the Persian fascination with comfort, it's hard not to acknowledge the bizarre contradictions of ancient civilizations. While we may think of ancient Persia as a land of towering palaces, royal banquets, and divine kings, they were also deeply pragmatic. They didn't let the harsh desert environment dictate the way they lived. They found ways to bend nature to their will. The yakshal was not just a building, it was a testament to their ingenuity and resilience. It symbolized the Persian ability to adapt, to innovate, and to make the seemingly impossible not only possible but sustainable. One of the most fascinating parts of the yakshal system was its ability to store ice in a climate that seemed to have no place for it. These ancient icehouses weren't reliant on refrigeration or electricity, of course. No, they took advantage of natural temperature variations. The subterranean spaces of the yakshal stayed relatively cool even during the scorching summer months, thanks to their thick, insulating walls. What's even more surprising is the fact that this was all achieved without any complex machinery, without the need for motors or cooling fans. It was simply about understanding the interplay of temperature, construction, and the natural environment. Let's step back and think about that for a moment. In a world without modern technology, the Persians managed to create structures that could trap cold air in the heart of the desert. It's no wonder that their achievements in architecture and engineering were admired by later civilizations. The Romans, for example, were inspired by the Persian model of cooling, and some scholars suggest that the Romans may have borrowed ideas from Persian architecture for their own icehouses and cool baths. This exchange of ideas, this blending of cultures, was part of what made the Persian Empire so influential, far beyond its immediate borders. As we near the final stretch of our story, it's time to talk about how these yakshals fit into the broader history of Persian society. You've probably heard about the Persian Empire's grandeur, its monumental palaces, its complex social structures, its art and architecture that still leave us awestruck today. But what we don't always think about is the role of these quieter, simpler systems in everyday life. In many ways, the yakshul was a quiet revolution, something so commonplace yet so extraordinary that it allowed Persian society to flourish in ways we don't often stop to appreciate. Take a moment to think about the role of ice today. It's such an afterthought, right? We use it in our drinks, to cool our homes, and to preserve food. But in ancient Persia, ice was a luxury that had a profound impact on society. It wasn't just about keeping your drinks cool or preserving your food for the winter. Ice, stored in the yakshuls, was an essential part of daily life. It allowed Persians to store food, to cool their homes, and, perhaps most importantly, to build a sense of comfort and community in the harshest of climates. One of the more surprising facts about the yakshul is that it wasn't just used for storing ice, it was also a place to store other essential items. Persian chefs, for example, would have used these ice houses to store ingredients that needed to be kept fresh, from dairy to fruits and meats. In a society where refrigeration was unheard of, this was an essential part of food preservation. The yakshul also served a more spiritual purpose. In a world dominated by the heat of the desert, the ice house was a space of calm and respite, a place where people could escape the scorching sun and find some cool relief, both literally and metaphorically. If we look closely, we see that the yakshul was not just about luxury or convenience, it was about survival. Historians still debate whether it was the development of ice storage that led to the rise of Persian urbanization, or if it was simply a reflection of an already advanced society. Regardless, the ice houses are a clear sign of the Persian people's ability to adapt to and shape their environment. They weren't just surviving the desert, they were thriving in it. The yakshul, in all its unassuming simplicity, was a masterpiece of design and function. It represented the ingenuity of the Persian people who, centuries before modern technology, found a way to tame the desert heat and turn it into an asset. The influence of the yakshul didn't stop at Persia's borders, either. As Persian civilization spread across the ancient world, so did the concept of the ice house. The Roman Empire, which often found itself in competition with Persia, borrowed ideas from their eastern neighbors when it came to architecture and public utilities. The idea of cooling systems that utilized natural principles would later be adopted by other civilizations, though not in such an elegant or sustainable way as the Persians. The Roman version of the ice house was more focused on luxury and excess, but the idea that cooling could be achieved without complex machinery was something the Romans learned from the Persians. And so, like many of the innovations we now take for granted, the roots of modern refrigeration can be traced back to the ancient world, and specifically to the desert. Now, imagine for a moment the quiet calm of a Persian evening. The heat of the day has finally begun to recede, and you walk through the cool, dimly lit space of the yakshul, your footsteps echoing in the cool air. The scent of ice, fresh and pure, lingers in the air, and you feel a sense of relief wash over you. In this moment, you're not just a visitor to a historical site. You're part of a tradition that has lasted for millennia. This is the genius of ancient Persian innovation. They didn't just create remarkable structures, they created systems that enhanced the lives of those who used them. The yakshul wasn't just a tool, it was a way of life. In fact, when we look at how other ancient cultures dealt with similar challenges, we see that the Persian approach was unique. While other civilizations struggled to find ways to cope with extreme temperatures, Persia's engineers were already thinking ahead. The Persian Empire was a place of constant learning, where science, architecture, and daily life were intertwined. The yakshul represents the epitome of this fusion, an example of how ingenuity and practicality could come together to improve the lives of ordinary people. But perhaps the most incredible thing about the yakshul is how it connects us to the past. Sure, the technology that underpins modern refrigeration has evolved beyond recognition, but in many ways, the basic principles of cooling that the Persians discovered remain the same. It's a reminder that, even in the most inhospitable places, human beings can find a way to thrive. And in the case of the Persians, that meant harnessing the elements, working with nature instead of against it, and creating a cool oasis in the heart of one of the world's hottest deserts. As we reflect on all that we've learned tonight, take a moment to appreciate the ingenuity of the Persians. Their legacy is more than just their grand palaces and epic battles. It's the small, quiet innovations like the Yakshal that remind us that sometimes, the most profound advances come from the simplest ideas. By now, you've wandered the shadowy corridors of the Yakshal, peered up at its domed silhouette against a star-punched Persian sky, and watched water turn to ice beneath a desert moon. But there's one more twist to this frosty marvel. Even long after the Persian Empire gave way to new powers and changing borders, the Yakshal never really disappeared. It lingered, quietly, humbly, through centuries of shifting dynasties, regional conflicts, and modern inventions. You see, the Yakshal was built to last. Its thick adobe walls, often mixed with a special blend of sand, clay, egg whites, and goat hair, no joke, were remarkably strong and shockingly good at insulation. Some of these ancient structures are still standing today, scattered across the Iranian plateau like silent sentinels of cleverness. Locals used them well into the 20th century, even as refrigerators and freezers entered the scene. For many rural communities, the old methods were still the most dependable ones. No electricity outages, no mechanical failures, just adobe and air and a little patience. And you might be thinking, okay, but surely this technique faded away with time, right? You'd be mostly right. But in a strange twist, architects and environmentalists have started to circle back. Historians still argue whether this is more of a practical revival or an aesthetic trend, but either way, these ancient principles are getting dusted off and reimagined for the modern world. Passive cooling, green architecture, low-energy climate control, it's all eerily familiar to anyone who's studied the Yakshal. In fact, in a few experimental eco-villages and desert developments, you can now spot structures inspired by Yakshals. Conical domes, wind catchers, underground water channels. Except now they've got solar panels strapped on top or a Wi-Fi router discreetly tucked in the corner. You smile at the thought. Persians too, climate change zero. But long before we got all smart with our buildings, the brilliance of the Yakshal rested in its simplicity. Remember those underground canets we talked about earlier? The ones that brought icy mountain runoff to where it was needed most? Those still function in places too, and there's a certain poetry in knowing that water that once cooled figs and lamb in 600 BCE might still trickle its way under the same sun-baked ground. A quiet stream running beneath your feet, out of sight, but always working. Kind of like the wisdom of the ancients. Of course, we should also acknowledge that ice wasn't the only thing these structures preserved. Oral history, cultural memory, communal ritual, those were tucked into the Yakshal too. Picture a group of children running errands for their grandmother, fetching chilled milk from the base of the dome. Imagine couples taking a midday stroll past the shady mouth of the Yakshal on their way to the bazaar. These weren't just utilities, they were fixtures of daily rhythm. And the older members of the community. They remembered the days when ice had to be harvested from nearby mountains, wrapped in straw, and raced home on donkeys before it turned into puddles. The Yakshal represented progress. A shift from scrambling for coolness to mastering it. From enduring the desert to bending it, just a little, to human comfort. Some local legends even cropped up around the Yakshals, stories of ghosts who refused to leave the cool chambers, or spirits said to protect the precious water. One fringe account even insists that certain domes had perfect acoustics, letting a whisper carry from the base all the way to the pointed peak. You picture it now, a bored teenager climbing up the ice pile to whisper secrets into the dome, just to hear them echo back. A medieval echo chamber, literally. As the Persian Empire evolved into new kingdoms and eventually became modern-day Iran, the architectural heritage of the Yakshal never really faded. It simply got absorbed. Travelers in the 1800s wrote about seeing them. Early photographers captured them in black and white prints. And some modern Iranians recall playing hide-and-seek in them when they were children, only learning years later what these domes truly were. Isn't it odd how we sometimes grow up inside history without realizing it? You live near something for years, assume it's just an odd hill or a strange barn, and only much later realize it's a miracle of ancient engineering. That kind of quiet brilliance deserves a moment of appreciation. Now, it's getting late. Or perhaps early, depending on your time zone. You're lying there, hopefully cozy and calm, and you've now walked through not just the icy corridors of the Yakshal, but the winding paths of Persian ingenuity, of cultural resilience and sustainable thinking. All from the comfort of your bed. In a world that races toward faster, colder, and newer, maybe there's something to be said for the slow, the clever, and the enduring. The ice house didn't shout for attention. It just worked. Year after year, brick by brick, cooling the desert with nothing but gravity, wind, and patience. So the next time you hear your fridge humming or toss an ice cube into your drink, give a little mental nod to the architects of ancient Persia. They were solving modern problems centuries before we gave them a name. And now, we arrive at the last corner of our frozen Persian dreamscape. You've wandered through wind catchers and brick tunnels, tiptoed across mountain-fed cannons, and stood in the hush of domed chambers where ice once gleamed like buried treasure. But tonight, before we close this long, sleepy scroll, let's sit with the legacy of what the Yakshul truly represents. Not just a structure, but a mindset. You see, the people who built these ice houses weren't just reacting to their harsh environment, they were cooperating with it. Where others might have tried to conquer the desert with brute force, the Persians struck a quiet truce. "You're hot," they seemed to say to the sun, "but we'll work with you." The shade, the angles, the mud brick recipe passed down like a family secret, each piece whispered respect for the rhythms of nature. And yet, this isn't some sepia-toned fairy tale. Historians still argue whether the Yakshul was truly as widespread or efficient as we like to imagine, or whether later restorations romanticized its use. Some argue the domes were sometimes used more for storage than actual ice. Others think they may have had ritual significance, more temple than fridge, depending on the season and the century. But what's not in doubt is this: they were brilliant. And they were beautiful. Imagine one last time that you're walking through a village on the edge of the Dasht-e-Kavr desert. The wind is dry, your clothes cling to your skin, and ahead of you, rising like a mirage from the dust, is that cone-shaped dome, half spaceship, half sand dune. A child runs past with a terracotta jug. You hear faint echoes from within, the murmur of voices, and maybe, just maybe, the splash of melting ice. You pause. You place your hand on the wall. It's cool. Against all logic, in a place that should burn your skin, it's cool. Inside, the ice sits in silence. It doesn't boast. It doesn't blink. It just is. And outside, life moves on. Markets bustle, goats bleat, someone spills a basket of dates. But the Yakshul remains, always a few degrees behind the chaos of the world. A small, quiet rebellion against the tyranny of the sun. You may never see one in person. You may never stand beneath that perfect dome or trace the slow spiral of its spiral ramp. But now, tucked deep inside your dreaming mind, you've built one of your own. A little place to keep things safe. A little chamber of cool in a hot, racing world. Let's slow it all down now. You've made it, friend. You've crossed the deserts of ancient Persia, wandered through engineering marvels older than most empires, and emerged with a head full of gentle wonder. Let that dome you built in your mind stay quiet now, half submerged in the stillness of sleep. Its walls are thick, its air is calm, and there's nothing more it needs to do tonight. Your breath is steady. The world outside might still be spinning. Fast cars, bright screens, buzzing alerts. But here, in this tucked-away corner of your evening, time is patient. There is nothing to rush. No sandstorm to outpace. Just the long, slow exhale of ancient stone under moonlight. Maybe you imagine yourself lying on a woven mat near the Yakshul, listening to the breeze as it moves through clay vents, cooling you by a few precious degrees. The stars are thick above you. The ground is firm below. And somewhere nearby, unseen but dependable, water glides silently beneath your feet. Let your limbs loosen. Let your thoughts drift like wind over sand. Nothing urgent waits for you in this moment. Not anymore. The engineers of old did their work so you wouldn't have to. The ice will keep. The walls will hold. And the night will take care of itself. You're safe here. You're home in a story older than memory. And the sun won't rise for a while yet. Quiet. Sleep now. Cool dreams.